coming to another wonderful seminar. For those who don't know me, I am Nina Bruni, a Spanish lecturer in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures, where Miss Gaye-Leon Williams, our guest speaker today, is pursuing her M.Phil in this wonderful and amazing title that I am not going to read because you have it there, you have it on the PowerPoint, and I am sure that she will enlighten us today with her first M.Phil presentation, right? This is important. Remember, all the M.Phil and PhD students must present seminars that are going to be assessed, right? So all of us are a little bit of positive assessors, and we wish you all the best with your presentation, after which we will have a few minutes for conversation and dialogue and questions, right? Okay, welcome to the podium.
Good afternoon again, everybody, and thanks for coming. As stated on the PowerPoint, my topic today is lingual interference and language teaching in Creole-speaking environments, and I'll be doing an exploration of the literature that I've been reading so far. So what exactly is my rationale for this? Well, for us who teach language in the Caribbean, we tend to use the models that are utilized in America and in Europe. Unfortunately for us, the assumption is that the student's native language is English, which we know in the Caribbean is not exactly the case. And so we have Caribbean students who continue to produce oral and written discourses that are replete with errors. So after completing 2 linguistics courses, which do not mean by any stretch of the imagination that I'm now an expert, right? I just became more conscious of the roles that errors play in language acquisition and in the structure of languages. So at the end of the semester, as a lecturer myself, I was able to be more aware and alert to the errors that my students were producing and to begin to categorize them superficially as well as speculate about the source of the errors. Ultimately, I really want to help my students because at the end of the day, as lecturers, we want them to acquire the language. And so the point of my doing the research then is to help my students, other Creole-speaking students, and the lecturers themselves move through this language acquisition process more efficiently. So a little bit of historical background on the Jamaican language situation. In the 17th century, the island was conquered by the British and they brought with them slaves from West Africa. This created a complex linguistic situation in that the colonizers spoke English and the West African slaves spoke a variety of dialects. So the slaves could not communicate with the colonizers, the slaves could not communicate amongst themselves either because they all had varying dialects. The socioeconomic difference between the colonizers and the slaves themselves created an even wider gap in that even though English was something that was desirable, it was unattainable because of the relationship between slave master and slave. So under those circumstances, a Creole, which is a mixture of the English lexicon and West African syntax, emerged. It was primarily used by the slaves to communicate amongst themselves and later on with the colonizers. So what are we going to be talking about today? We'll be looking at the Jamaican language situation, which presents a unique context in which to learn a foreign language. Linguists now agree, the majority of them do agree that Jamaican Creole is a language. However, there are contending views as to what our exact language situation is. Is it a Diglossia? Is it a Creole continuum? Or is it a situation where we are a bilingual country? So I'll be looking at these different views. I'll also look very briefly at the different types of lingual and cross-linguistic interference, the various types of error analyses that are used to examine this interference, proposed corrective measures being studied, problems that we face as Jamaican language teachers, and the correct gaps in the research. And then at the end, I'll kind of just summarize what I've learned thus far, what my working research topic and questions are, and how I plan to answer that, as well as the aims of my study, which are all subject to change, of course. So the Jamaican language situation, first up is Diglossia. It is a non-linguistic descriptor. Our own Professor Devonish defines it as the existence of two separate language varieties, each with its own function in society. So we have two languages that are coexisting. We have one that is called the high variety, that is spoken mostly by the upper class in society, and we have the low variety, which is usually associated with the lower class in society. So for us in Jamaica, the higher variety would be standard Jamaican English, which is not the same as British English, and our low variety then would be Jamaican Creole. So normally you would expect to hear standard Jamaican English being utilized in places of formal education, the places of formal business, in parliament, etc. And then you would relegate Jamaican Creole, the low variety, to the confines of, conversation with friends in your homes, etc. The role of Jamaican Creole, however, has been shifting higher. We find that we hear it a lot more in media. We hear our parliamentarians using it as they're campaigning, or even as they're debating a bill that is on the table. And we find that you find it a lot in the work-related settings. Arguably, according to Christy, there are pros and cons to this shift, right? So we have Jamaican Creole gaining some prominence. For those that are talking about Jamaican Creole as the situation as a Creole continuum, what we have then is the coexistence of a lexifier language and its Creole variety, meaning the standard variety coexisting with the dialect. And because it's a continuum, then you have the basic level where the basilex, where it's all Creole. It's just raw Creole. These people do not use English any at all. And then as you go up the continuum, we get to the mesolect, which is not quite raw Jamaican Creole, but still not English. And then we have the higher variety, which is the acrolectal speech. And that looks like standard Jamaican English, but it is still Jamaican Creole. So Sanchez et al., some lecturers done by Northern Caribbean University, did a study here in Jamaica, and they observed that the socioeconomic stratification in our island kind of matches the Jamaican Creole continuum. So you find that the lower class primarily use the basilectal speech, the middle class would use mesolectal speech, and those of the upper class would use acrolectal speech. Then there's the issue of bilingualism, which sounds very close to Diglossia. So we have two languages that are coexisting yet again, but one is considered to be stronger than the other. So in the case of Jamaica, the stronger language would be clearly Jamaican Creole, and the weaker language would then be standard Jamaican English. What researchers have theorized generally is that when a student is able to read and write and is literate in their dialects, then acquiring the standard variety becomes easier because they have something to compare it to in the form of their N1. We cannot talk about bilingualism without talking about code mixing and code switching, which is basically going from one language variety to the next, mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-idea. So if Jamaica is a bilingual nation, then the thought is that foreign languages are not second languages, because bilingual means we already have two. So foreign languages are now third languages. And the implications then are different, perhaps, from cross-linguistic interference. Which one of the two languages that constitute the bilingualism is going to be more prominent in this interference with the third language? So, and another question is the language transfer, which is another word they use for interference, positive, negative, or do we have elements of both, right? So this is where studies on interference are needed. So we have the Jamaican language situation, we're talking about lingual interference, and we're talking about error analysis. So as previously stated, we have two language varieties that are utilized here in Jamaica, and we notice that they interfere with each other a lot. If we look at how our students write something for English, we understand that if they don't have a strong or good acquisition of English, there's going to be a lot of Jamaican Creole interference that is present. So when a third language or a foreign language is introduced, one can expect the same thing will happen, this time from the two languages. Studies on interference can examine, for example, which of the language interferes the most. And an error analysis can be used to rank the errors hierarchically and according to their frequency of occurrence. It helps us, the error analyses help us to ascertain the actual linguistic sources of these errors. Corrective measures form another part or another aspect to the studies on interference, because what they look at are approaches that can be used to help lessen the frequency and difficulties of the errors that are produced. So what is lingual interference? This is a growing area of research. To go to an old definition of interference, Shaw defines it as the carrying over of habits formed in your native language and imposing that onto the second language that you are learning. Right? So he referred to it as a transfer. And that was a term that they borrowed from the field of behaviorism. The issues of interference are also connected to the issues of language contact and language mixing, which often arise when we have people with different language backgrounds and linguistic capabilities that have a need to communicate. The different types of interference are interlingual, intralingual, and extralingual. And transfer can be positive or negative or both, depending on the structure of the language. Briefly about error analysis. So there are several theories on error analyses, right? There's contrast analysis, there's one that is called error analysis, and then there's interlanguage. Often though, the types of analyses are used in combination to provide a more complete analysis of the languages being studied and the related structures being investigated. So error analyses offer us a window through which to observe the various types of interference. Now, we can't talk about error analysis without defining what an error is and distinguishing that from mistakes. So some researchers posit that the errors are systematic, consistent deviances that are characteristic of the learner's interlanguage. And some of these terms will get defined as we go through the rest of the presentation. So at a given stage of learning, right, the learner's interlanguage is going to be different, and there are going to be certain types of errors that will indicate where they are in the process of language acquisition. On the other hand, mistakes tend to be random guesses and slips, and often the student, once they recognize that, they can self-correct. They don't need somebody to point out that this is an error that you're making that is systematic. And the errors are the mistakes are usually secondary to a breakdown in the language production. So interlingual interference and error analysis. So what is interlingual interference? That is the transfer of the grammar structures in the native language to that of the grammar structures in the target language. So here we have your native language. So for instance, Jamaican Creole interfering how you produce English and how you use English. This type of interference does not result in the majority of errors in language acquisition, and it is usually assessed using the contrast analysis method. So you contrast the native language against the target language. You look at the areas of similarities and the areas of disparities. The disparities are where you're going to find the greater rate of error production. The theory behind contrast analysis is that if you compare the languages and you see the areas that are different, then you can predict where your errors will fall, and you can premeditate a remedial methodology to combat that in a classroom setting. So for example, in English, the word order in the phrase, the red book, is the article, followed by the red, which is adjective, and the word book, which is a noun. If you are to translate that into Spanish, then you're going to say el libro rojo. So now you have the article first still, but the adjective and the noun switches place. And what you have with students who are just learning Spanish is that they will always write el rojo libro, because in their minds, el libro rojo, which is literally translated as the book red, doesn't make sense. It does not follow what they know in English. So you have them imposing an English word order structure on Spanish word order. And oddly enough, the Jamaican Creole word order is the same as English, the red book, right? It's still the article, followed by the adjective, followed by the noun. So this type of interference can also be analyzed using the error analysis method. And that is where we collect data, we categorize the errors, we classify them, and then we look at their source, their linguistic source. And in this case, the source would be the native language grammar, the structure of that language. Now to intralingual interference and the error analysis. So intralingual interference is interference that is secondary to the grammar of the target language itself. So this type of interference is greater where structures exist in the target language that do not exist in the native language or native languages. For example, in Spanish, every noun is assigned a gender. In English, that does not exist. In Jamaican and Creole, it does not exist. And so what you find is when it comes to gender agreement, there's a lot of errors. And 9 times out of 10, the students write the masculine forms, even for feminine nouns. But they have nothing to which they can compare it. And that is part of the reason why they have the error. Another observance with intralingual interference is that the same simplification processes observed during the acquisition of your first language are also observed here in an L2 situation. So for example, they will overgeneralize a rule. So they acquired this rule, they said that every noun has a gender, no verbs have gender, right? So I can't say bailo, which is I dance because I'm a female, so I have to say baila because things that end in A are feminine. So they're applying this rule where it does not need to be applied. So this type of interference is usually analyzed using error analysis or the interlanguage method. Basically, both of these look at the hypotheses that the learners form as they're acquiring this new language. So interlanguage is that intergrammar, that is neither native language grammar and it's not target language grammar. It's the in-between phase as they're learning the second language. And there are different hypotheses that the student formulates subconsciously and in the application of the rules of the grammatical structures. Extralingual interference and error analysis. So extralingual interference refers to the errors that are secondary to factors that are not linguistic at all. So is the student tired? Is it that the teacher has a methodology that does not coincide with the learning methodology of the learning type of the student? Is it that the rules were poorly taught because the teacher themselves do not understand how to teach these rules? Is it that the student has no motivation for learning the language? So we have all these non-linguistic factors, even socioeconomic background and the way society views language can be an extralingual interference in the learning in the acquisition of another language. So these errors are not secondary to the structure of neither the native language, the target language, nor the target language. And the error analysis that we usually apply is the error analysis method. So you're looking at the category that is extralingual. That would be the category of errors. So interference, error analysis, and corrective measures. So another aspect to the study of lingual interference is how to reduce the production of errors, or once the errors have been identified, how do we assist learners of a particular target language to move past their current stage to a more advanced one and avoid the issue of what we call fossilization, which is they get stuck exactly where they are and they acquire nothing else, right? So previous studies have either proposed corrective measures or have researched corrective measures to ascertain which, if any, is most effective. Currently, several studies are proposing and testing the effectiveness of consciousness-raising activities that will result in a greater language awareness, and other studies examine the effectiveness of corrective feedback. So some of the information is cut out from the slide. The noticing theory, consciousness-raising techniques, and language awareness. So the thought behind this is that if we can raise the students and the teachers' awareness of their own language, when they go to acquire a target language, then they are more aware of their own structures, and then their thought is that it will predispose them to a greater language awareness of the target language as well. So researchers have proposed teachers be trained to recognize potential problems and pre-plan remedial activities, especially as it pertains to raising language awareness. So for example, comparing the two languages where there are similar structures, so the students can take what they know and apply that to what they don't know. Deliberate instructional strategies aimed at inculcating the awareness or working from a context-rich base, informing students linguistically, then towards informing students linguistically, rather than vice versa. So instead of giving them all these rules without the context, give them a context in which to apply the rule. Changing the perspective about errors in second language acquisition. It is the norm and it is understood that errors are indicative of how far you are along the process of acquisition for a first language. But often most of us look at the errors when we're teaching a target language as they're just not learning, they can't get it, something is wrong, instead of looking at the errors positively in the same light, stating, okay, these errors show that they've acquired these structures, but they still have not acquired these ones in the target language. In explicit and implicit corrective feedback. So in Falharsi et al. Study, the explicit correction involved feedback in addition to examples of the correct forms, right? So they're pointing out errors and then giving them examples of the correct forms, versus implicit correction, which only involved a demonstration of the correct form. So they didn't point out the mistakes, they're just telling you this is how it's supposed to be done, and from that, you should be able to see where your mistakes are and and make the corrections. There's direct and indirect feedback, also looked at in the Falharsi study. So in the direct feedback, the teacher provides the correct form, and in the indirect feedback, teacher indicates the errors without providing the correct forms. And the results from their research were conflicting. So the jury is still out as to which one is most effective, but from their literature review, they found that indirect feedback was more beneficial in the short term than direct feedback. So what are some of the problems for our language teachers in Jamaica? The use of Creole in the classroom has pros and cons. The big issue is that exchange doesn't occur. Creole stays and they still don't acquire English. So what you have is the teacher breaking down and explaining in Creole, and the student leaves with a better understanding of what is required, but they still have not acquired the English structures. So both languages become so blended at times that neither the lecturers nor the students notice the difference. Some educators do not have a linguistic background and thereby lack the training to notice or become aware of the specific linguistic background of the students and to tailor the lessons to suit that. The problem is not unique to Jamaica. Marriott Cooper did a study in Trinidad where she looked at an urban school that was that majored in the languages and another school where their focus was the sports, and they had the same issues in Trinidad. And one of the things she noticed is that the area she thinks is largely ignored by the government, and therefore it's an under-researched area that could have been of benefit to the students. So what have I learned thus far? I have learned that there are different taxonomies for classifying errors. There's Burt and Kiparski, and then there's Richards and Fernandez. That basically means, do we classify them as intra, and extra-lingual? Do we classify if they're a developmental category, etc.? Certain structures are harder to grasp than others because there are no English and Creole structures for comparison. Renee Davy found in her study of high school students here in Jamaica that there is some linguistic transfer from Jamaican Creole to Spanish. However, when she did her analysis, the transfer was not statistically significant. And some error types are secondary to both the inter and intralingual interference. So most studies find that majority of the errors are intralingual, but this does not negate the need for a study that looks at our language situation and how we can better tailor a classroom setting that is going to help our students acquire foreign languages. Transfer is greater where there is less exposure to the target language and increases with greater exposure to more complex structures. And then language mode can also affect transfer. And Davy was speculating that is it that because Jamaican Creole has been given such a quote-unquote bad rap and looked at so poorly, is it that they are switching off their Jamaican Creole, and how is that impacting their ability to learn the Spanish? The gaps in research, current gaps in research are many. My study will not cover all of these gaps. Some of them are that most of the studies only address errors produced in one type of discourse. So more often it's easier to look at something that's written than to record something oral and then analyze that. The studies are usually not conducted for an extended period of time. At most you'll have them observing students over one academic year. They do not simultaneously examine all areas of transfer. Is it transfer in the lexic? They usually choose one often it is syntax and morphology, and where we don't really get studies on lexicon and phonology. They do not combine the error analysis with the implementation of the corrective measures, then go back and do a post-analysis to see if these measures were effective. And sometimes, and majority of the studies have not examined our particular language situation in Jamaica and other English lexified Creole speaking environments. Another thing is that the sample tends to be younger people, younger children or high school students. So we don't find that any studies done at the tertiary level. And then there's a call for creation of textbooks that use the comparisons of Jamaican Creole and Spanish, not just English to Spanish. So what are my aims, right? I want to initiate a model for language teaching that considers the current language situation in Jamaica. And that model would consider both Jamaican Creole and standard Jamaican English. I want to create a research design that is both generalizable to other foreign languages, because I'm looking at Spanish, and that is replicable at the various educational levels. And to hopefully change our perspective of error production in second language acquisition, viewing it more positively as an indicator of progress through the language acquisition process. And to continue the conversation about our linguistic background and to create a classroom environment that recognizes where our students are linguistically and build on that. The anticipated impact is that we will foster greater language awareness amongst lecturers and students alike, and that will positively affect the foreign language acquisition process. And to highlight the importance of our own unique language situation, and that in our country and other English-speaking Creole countries. So what is my working topic and what are my working questions? So it's lingual interference and language teaching, specifically in a Creole-speaking environment. The question one is, what are the most frequently occurring error types observed in written discourses of tertiary level students acquiring Spanish, and what are their sources? So how often these errors are occurring, which ones are the most difficult, and where are they coming from? Is it interlingual? Is it intralingual? Is it extralingual? Which approaches to teaching are the most effective in our Creole-speaking environment for foreign languages? And then third, what are some of the ways that the language teachers in a Creole-speaking environment can implement those approaches that we enlisted in question 2? So what is my research plan? The first phase will be to collect the final examination scripts of students who have completed 1 year of introductory Spanish in a tertiary institution, and then perform an error analysis. That error analysis, from that I'll conduct a mixed method study in terms of quantitatively analyzing the errors. What are they? How often are they occurring? Which ones are the most difficult? And then qualitatively to look at their linguistic sources. And this was done by someone in 1972. Haven't seen anybody replicate that kind of a methodology. Probably won't be as quantitative because hers was very detailed, but to somewhat replicate that for my own study. To interview the lecturers to help me understand what are the approaches that they are currently using in the classroom for teaching the language, to elicit potential linguistic and extralingual factors that can be resulting in the learner error production. And to ask students to fill out a questionnaire to elicit the level of exposure to Spanish prior to attending the university. For those students who have successfully completed Spanish up to K level or something like that, we wouldn't want the results to be skewed and not be able to say, okay, it's because of these techniques that we have applied why their error production is less. It could have been because of their greater exposure and not necessarily the teaching approaches that were implemented. The second phase would be to implement a set of language teaching approaches tailored specifically to our Creole-speaking environment for one academic year. And then these approaches will of course be informed by theory. So we're looking at noticing theory, consciousness raising activities. How can we increase their language awareness? And then the third phase would be to redo an error analysis to see were these methods effective. So do I know exactly what methods we'll be testing yet? No, I have to do the analysis to see what errors we're getting in order to decide what method, which teaching approaches we can use. And also to ascertain from both the lecturers and the students, how was the implementation of these strategies? Is it something that's feasible? It might be good in theory, but then when we go to apply it practically, it might be more cumbersome than we initially thought. So to ascertain that as well. And that is it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Williams. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Ingrid Montgomery's presence because she is Ms. Williams' supervisor. And we also know that Professor Ramsey is supporting this supervision as well and research. So we wish to thank you for your substantial presentation. I think you are going straight to a PhD with this.
That's it.
Thank you for the overview, for this literature review that you have presented, and you have projected how well you have managed this. You have absorbed it already. Okay? So we foresee a wonderful final product out of this. So now it's time for questions. Of course.
Yes, Professor.
Right. Well, thank you for interesting presentations. Good to see that you're making progress already with later writing. I have a few comments on the methodology that you're proposing. You said you were going to collect, you were going to base your research on the examination scripts of students. I think you would want to either not use that or supplement it with other materials, because we have to remember that examination scripts are written under very stressful conditions and do not necessarily reflect students' true competencies. That's one. The other thing is that if you're going to do an error analysis, then you have to also know what kind of error-free language you should be able to expect at that level.
Right.
Because there may be errors that are expected at that level and that it would be inappropriate to do anything about because it's not appropriate to the level of the instructional level and the developmental level. And we know, of course, that second language acquisition proceeds in stages, and at each stage there are particular errors that are expected, and that there is a progression in which these errors can be addressed in your teaching strategies. And so I was wondering why we're going to stick to just year one, because it would be good to see actually what kind of progress students make through the years.
Right.
So are there particular errors that they produce in year one that you are not seeing again in year two, or not seeing again in year three? If that is the case, then there is nothing that you're supposed to do.
Right.
Because those errors are actually being addressed in the current curriculum. The other thing is that in order to get at students' competence, you need to test them differently. So it's possible that they have errors in production, but that they actually do know the correct structure, and that it's just because they weren't really reviewing their writing or they were stressed that they're producing the error. So usually in second language acquisition, if you're going to be using production material, you want to supplement that with testing materials that actually test competencies. So that, for instance, if there are particular errors that we want to get at, you provide students with 2 or 3 sentences in the target language, one of which include the error, but they all use the same words, they look pretty similar, and the student, you find out from the student whether they consider all these utterances to be correct or incorrect.
Yes.
And if at that point they're not able to pick up the incorrect structure, then clearly the error in production reflects a lack of knowledge in their competence. Final comment is the terminology. Extra-lingual is not a term that I'm very familiar with in linguistics. We would normally say extra-linguistic factors rather than extra-lingual factors. And lingual. Maybe it comes from Spanish, from your Spanish reading.
It's one of the terms that I've seen in some of the stuff that the newer literature that I was reading. It's not found in the older seminal works like Selinka or the other people that are the foundational studies. You don't really find extra-lingual as a term. You do see extra-linguistics.
All right. Linked to that, in case you want to respond right away, why is it that you are choosing only written samples and not oral? I'm thinking about my students.
Okay.
The oral production is very good, with errors, but it's very good. So why is it? Is it for a practical issue?
Right, so the methodology is still in process in terms of development. Some of the testing types that you're suggesting I've also seen it being done in the literature. So can't fit everything in a 30 minutes presentation per se. And as I read more, then the methodology will be more fleshed out. Why not oral? And oral tends to not be the number one choice because of the recording, transcribing, and then going back to analyzing. So it's more of a practical issue than not having research out there on that type of discourse. And some researchers actually prefer oral production because it's more spontaneous. So it's not as thought out as the written discourses, but that is something I can look at, also looking at.
Especially if you are going for
I have a question. Thank you very much for a very lucid presentation. And considering it's a work in progress, nothing has been decided on, I think you are well on your way for a very productive thesis. I wanted to ask you something about the corrective measures. I think that was what you said. You had your research thus far had indicated that people had used, that researchers had used either or. Is that what it was?
Right.
Either or?
People have looked at, now they're mostly looking at consciousness raising techniques,
right,
and trying to get students and lecturers alike to be more aware of the language structure that they have, and also to use that as a foundation to which you can compare the target language. Other studies also look at how we correct the errors. So it's not just raising the awareness, but what kind of feedback are we giving to the students, and which type of feedback is most effective. So perhaps we could look at facets of both there.
That is what I was thinking. If you consider maybe using a kind of blended
approach instead of something that is just approach individually. Yes, sir?
Okay, please specify what methods you use to error analysis.
Quantitative?
Yes, in China we use a discourse analysis software, so we have to code the error types. Right? So the coding process is rather complicated. It's focused on the coding. You said in your presentation that you want to know the frequency of a certain type of error. So I guess you have to use the discourse analysis software. Right?
So there are different tests that can be used. Off the top of my head, I cannot remember their names. And like I said, I haven't fully fleshed out the actual methodology as yet. So I'm not 100% certain as to which specific tests I'll be using to look at that hierarchy. But there are different tests that have been proposed in the study that I've been doing.
But yes, we need to remember that this is her first seminar presentation that she has to solve. For that, So we have 4 more minutes because we have an exam at 5 o'clock. So we have room for 1 or 2 short questions and then continue.
I was impressed with the fact that she said textbooks could be written in the standard in Spanish as well as the Jamaican Creole. I think that's a very interesting point. I would like to see that, persons take up that and see, because many times our students have to learn Spanish, they say more effectively when Creole is used, is compared, used along with the Spanish in the classroom. Colleagues have told me that when they use the Creole along with the Spanish, the students tend to understand immediately what they are trying to say. And I thought that was very
thought-provoking, and I would like to see that well that could be implemented. Also, too, I would like to know if you intend to explore the role of culture, what role culture plays.
Yes, culture has a very large role to play in terms of language acquisition and attitudes towards language learning, etc. So that could also be something that is mentioned even briefly in the actual process.
One question. I realize that you are comparing German and Creole, well, in your analysis, German and Creole and Spanish. Is there a case where it can be extended to the wider Caribbean, or is it just a study that would elucidate issues pertaining to acquisition in our context?
The intent is to create something that could be replicable in other English lexified groups, so something that's in Trinidad and Barbados and so on, where they have English as their standard language, but they have a Creole that goes along with it, and the Creole is the mass vernacular. So maybe the structures in their Creole are not exactly similar to Jamaican, but the way the study is designed, they can replicate the same to kind of come with a similar analysis for their own language situations.
And I mean, I think I saw from your literature that there were actually studies from Trinidad and parts of the Caribbean.
Right, yeah, they are studies for UE.
Right, you could incorporate.
Yes, yes. All right. Okay, so I guess we can continue outside. So thank you so much. We wish you all the best, and we are looking forward for seminar number 2.